oh, it's for Steve's client instead. And so you kind of trick people that way. But basically, I'm of the view that, look, if you have a product you're not happy with, then you have to build it yourself. And what I didn't like about the baseball projections that you saw is that they projected just one line of stats for each player. They'd say, well, Derek Jeter next year will hit, if he's not injured, he'll hit 290 with 8 home runs and 78 RBIs, and not have variance as actually occurs. I mean, everyone who's watched baseball knows that you might have a young third baseman who can go on to be the next Mike Schmidt, or if he's on the Cubs or something, then disaster will strike and he'll hit 220 instead. But knowing that, predictions as much, the way I see it, I really think of it as forecasting, is as much about knowing what you don't know as knowing what you do know and kind of mapping out the whole landscape. So my idea was to use history to create different ranges and different scenarios to map different career paths that a player might have.
But it wasn't baseball that actually led you to leave your job. It was poker.
Yeah. So there was, poker is, so I'm actually going next week to play, it's a tough life to go from Aspen, I'm playing in the World Series of Poker next week in Vegas.
And that's not the first time.
I've played a couple other times, but I mostly made my living from 2004 to 2007 or thereabouts playing, sometimes at the casino, but mostly online. Online you can play 5 tables at once if you want. There's no physical constraint, so it goes a lot faster. But anyway, what happened in 2003, you had a guy named Chris Moneymaker, so perfect name. He was kind of had a job not unlike mine. He worked for an accounting firm, I think Deloitte & Touche, and deposited $20 at a poker site called Poker Stars and kept parlaying that up and eventually won the World Series of Poker worth a $2 million prize and defeated all these pros along the way. So great story. The thing was, he was actually kind of a fairly average player who got pretty lucky, but they show it continuously on ESPN. When they show poker on TV, there are 2 things. First of all, they'll edit the broadcast, so he's the protagonist, so to speak. So the 20% of hands that he'd play really badly, they'd edit out. And I just think if we had that function in life, right, where we could delete the 20% of really dumb shit that we do, we would be really in good shape. And also on poker, they show you what cards your opponent has. So if you're clairvoyant, and on top of that, you can delete the 20% of hands you play really badly, then poker is pretty easy. So people saw it on TV, thought, I'm going to be a poker player too, and I played a little bit in college and had a little bit of number sense, and so for a while it was a good way to make money and pay the bills. It's gotten a lot tougher since then. The kind of bubble has burst a little bit.
Well, as much as I love sports and poker, I'm really interested in talking to you about politics, because in 2007, you turned to politics under the pseudonym Poblano, right? And before I ask you about that name, you were really frustrated with sort of the state of political analysis in this country. What was so frustrating to you?
I think part is I had kind of lived through the Moneyball wars, so to speak, in baseball, where, look, baseball is the most data-rich field ever, pretty much, where everything that's happened on a major league playing field in the past 150 years has been written down and recorded. You have people who spend their whole lives, or part of their lives, going down and looking up, did Hack Wilson have 2 doubles or 1 double in this game in 1924 or something, right? So very, very rigorous, very, very high quality data. The game is very linear. It lends itself to analysis. But it's also a small and kind of closed off industry, only 30 teams. You might have a GM who stays in the game for life, or a beat writer, and so teams just weren't being very innovative, and a few teams like Billy Bean's A's and then the Red Sox and the Tampa Rays figured out that there were some inefficiencies in the market. For example, guys that took a lot of walks were underrated potentially. Guys that were college players instead of high school players were underrated, and they started to apply these numbers, and it really paid off. And eventually, every other team kind of realized, look, we had the Yankees, for example, we have a lot of money, so let's spend a lot of money and be smart, and then we'll still kick everyone's ass, basically, right? So that market that bubble burst too, in the sense of it's not so easy for a small market team to compete anymore, because all the teams are doing this stuff now, but you did see a big change in a few years in how baseball was covered. But not so much for elections. I think particularly in 2007, the perception, for example, was that Hillary Clinton is really inevitable, and that she couldn't possibly lose, and that Rudy Giuliani was going to win the Republican nomination, and so forth. And people don't realize. People think, oh, I'm the guy who always says, oh, the polls are are accurate. That's not exactly right. I just say that we can go back to history and see how accurate the polls might or might not be. In primary elections, the polling is really, really wild. Early on especially, you have 5 or 6 candidates in the field. People haven't made their decisions yet. What the polls say 6 months in advance might not mean very much, whereas in general elections, by the time you get to October, everyone's pretty locked in. But yeah, I was frustrated by the emphasis on the narrative or on kind of who won the day is a phrase that's sometimes
horse race
used.
aspect.
The horse race aspect, and I don't mind horse race stuff. Right? I'm a sports fan. I'm a guy who's made money as a poker player or a gambler. So I don't mind the election for the election's sake. But there was a lot of coverage on what I would call the noise, irrelevant distractions that for people who are news junkies that don't really answer this question about who's actually likely to win.
And you said you turned to politics because unlike finance or sports, it had become a lazy industry, pushing a gossipy groupthink that often proved wrong. Why do you think that political reporters were so late to kind of embrace data and statistical models?
I think it's kind of an analogous case to baseball in some ways, where it's a high-profile industry, but it's pretty small. You have the 3 networks, or now the 4 networks, and that used to be kind of about it, really. And I think they did an admirable job in many ways for a number of years, but also meant that there was a certain lack of need to innovate, right? That you had to kind of pay your dues, and you get into that culture, and it's my feeling it's a bit of a cliquish kind of industry, and so people who think differently might not really be listened to exactly. But then you have kind of blogs emerging. You have simultaneously the emergence of the wide availability of polling and other types of data that's for public consumption and is not relying on insider information. It's all based on here's stuff you can download anywhere and build a model yourself.
So do you think that mainstream media didn't really know how to collect and synthesize all this new data that suddenly became available?
I think so. I mean, I think people are taught to think in terms of narratives and kind of as storytellers, and that can be really valuable in some ways. But I think of it more as, and I know it's a little pretentious, but kind of more of a scientific take on things, where you're trying to actually analyze information and where you have some obligation to the evidence, where you don't tell the story that is the most compelling and neatest story. You kind of tell the story that you think is told by the data. Now, that's a difficult question because it's not always self-evident, but it does mean that you're trying to apply a bit more rigor to things. The idea of making predictions is a way in science. You make hypotheses or predictions to test to make sure that your ideas aren't full of shit, basically, right? That your idea of how something works is actually accurate in the objective world, and so you test your ideas. So that's another thing that I think, the tradition is that campaign desks are very reluctant to characterize who's ahead in the race. They love to say too close to call, even when it isn't. I'm not talking about election night itself. I don't mind some caution on waiting for more ballots to get in before you call a state on election night. But
do you think to keep the race more exciting?
But yeah, so people talk a lot about, well, does the press have a liberal bias or a conservative bias? And maybe it does.
Bias.
But they have a ratings bias that's much stronger than either of those, right? And you can see it very explicitly where, for example, in the debates this past year, where it became Obama had pulled way ahead after the convention and then did quite badly at the first debate, but was a little better at the second debate, and by the kind of polls, the public said Obama had won. But you had people kind of in the press saying, well, it was close enough that it's a tie, and the tie means that Romney wins, right? Because that's the standard is lower for him. So it was kind of blatant example of that kind of hoping for the race to stay close. You also have, by the way, kind of a pile-on and groupthink bias. I remember before the first debate, you had the 47% comments. Then you had Benghazi, which is now seen, I think maybe correctly, is kind of a problem for U.S. intelligence. But at the time, the buzz was all about how was Romney's response, right? Had Romney's response been undiplomatic, instead of thinking about the more newsworthy event of what actually happened there, and should people in the State Department have been more accountable. So that was another example where, because the mood then was so much that Romney is collapsing, people saw that narrative and piled on that story in a way that in that case was was kind of biased toward Obama, whereas it worked later in a different way, I think a couple of weeks afterward.
You have been uncannily accurate. You correctly predicted every state but one in the 2008 presidential race, Mazel. Indiana being the exception, and all 35 U.S. Senate races, you correctly predicted every state in the 2012 presidential race and 31 out of the 33 U.S. Senate races. That had to feel pretty good, especially because a lot of people, Nate, were out there talking smack about you.
On election night, well, let me preface this by saying a couple. First of all, there are other sites that did nearly as well or just as well, that were taking kind of similar approaches. If you had just taken a straight average of the polls with no kind of fancy technology applied to it, you'd have gotten 48 or 49 states right.
What happened in Indiana?
Well, in Indiana, my theory is they need a recount there. No, I'm just kidding. But one thing that can make a difference, a team with a candidate with a very strong turnout operation can overperform its polls a bit. And especially in Indiana, I lived in Chicago at the time, and every Democrat I knew, since Illinois was not a swing state, was going down to knock on doors in Gary, Indiana, and so forth. It was a state, meanwhile, that Republicans thought, we're not going to lose Indiana, right? And so I think they got 120% turnout or something in Gary, and won as a result. But look, we're not supposed to, we put these things in terms of probabilities, where it's not too hard to know that Barack Obama is going to win New York, right? To know who's going to win Colorado, I think we had Obama as an 80-20 favorite on election night. So what that means is that, yeah, you'll get that prediction right most of the time, but you're supposed to have those 20% occurrences occur now and then. So from my point of view, we've been a little bit lucky, right? And sooner or later, it's going to catch up, and so
Well,
so
2010 wasn't so good, right? Wasn't as good.
2010 was we got
midterms.
I think we missed 2 Senate races, and we're off by like 8 or 9 House seats. But we're doing it. The principle in prediction is called calibration, and what that means is that out of everything you say is a 8 out of 10 chance, then how many of those do you get right? And it should be 8 out of 10, not 10 out of 10. When the weather forecasters say there's a 20% chance of rain, that forecast is well calibrated. You might not like when the 20% occurs, but it does occur over the long run, about 2 times in 10, not a lot more, not a lot less. So that's the goal. We're not saying that we can distill voting behavior down to any type of perfect number. You're going to have some error, and the error is going to be a lot more in some types of races, much harder, as I said, to forecast primaries than general elections, much harder to forecast down ballot races for the U.S. House, for the polling might not be very good. And so it's just a way to kind of quantify, like I said, kind of what we know and what we don't know. I think in the presidential race, we probably know more from the polls than people want to let on that say, oh, it's still a kind of too close to call horse race, but that's not always true.
You used something called the Bayesian method, which I tried to read about and understand, and honestly, I don't think we should waste anybody's time here because it's so complicated and confusing. But when you look at voting trends or polls in swing states, what exactly, Nate, are you analyzing? I mean, tell us just sort of the whole pool of information that you go through and digest and dissect.
So we're really looking at, I think one principle of building a model is that a model is inherently a simplification of the world, right? Because the real world is sometimes too complicated to keep track of everything. And so basically the way we have a presidential forecast, we have 2 variables. Basically we have polls and economy. And economy, we look at 6 indicators that are updated in real time, kind of create an economic index. And polls, we look at the polls. We look at every poll in a formula that's determined ahead of time. So polls that have been more accurate in the past automatically get a higher weight. Polls that call people with cell phones. Right now, it's now up to about 40% of the country now doesn't have a landline in their home.
So how inaccurate are polls because of that?
Well, they've had. Some of these cheapo polls that are not calling people with cell phones have had pretty bad years. And it's one of the excuses, I guess they'd have, or not excuses, but one of the reasons why you had some polling firms missed low on Obama's numbers in 2012 is because people who don't have cell phones, right, or don't have or landlines rather, tend to be people who are younger, more urban, maybe a bit kind of lower middle class, right? So all these are democratic voting characteristics. You can try and counteract that by weighting, but it doesn't always work. And so yeah, if you don't call people with cell phones, then then I'm not sure you can really kind of call your poll scientific at this point, right? Although some polls that tried to reach people on the internet did quite well. Now, since almost everyone's on the internet, then that seems to be a good counterbalance to the people you can't reach on the phone anymore.
So what else are you going through?
So like I said, the other kind of major component of the model is the economy. As people, I think, know, there's a strong relationship between how well the economy does and how likely the incumbent is to be reelected. And so it's just a number of broad-based economic measures like unemployment and inflation and GDP and industrial production. So just kind of the six most major, the stock market, most major economic indicators, where they are put into an index, and then we can kind of track that historically. And what that index suggested to me in this past election is that Obama was kind of in a place where the economy was clearly below average, but not a case like 1980 where there was a gigantic recession during the election year. It was not nearly as bad as 2008. So the economy was below average, but incumbents normally get reelected. So the case where the economy is a little bit below average, but not too much below average, that's kind of where the incumbent gets their mulligan sometimes. That's, I think, what happened here is people said, like there's just enough progress economically that, I don't really like this Romney guy that much, so kind of grit and bear it and vote for Obama instead. Then they had a good turnout operation that kind of helped their margins a little bit more in the swing states. But that was kind of the story that the model. So I think we got 50 out of 50 states right on election night. I think that was kind of not as hard as we had 49 out of 50 states right actually in June when we launched the forecast. We had Florida for Romney then instead of Obama, but just based on where the election was in this zone where the average incumbent running for re-election, the average election incumbent wins by 7 or 8 points, right? So it's a pretty large handicap that he has, and the economy was just making enough progress. The last couple of jobs reports were good that Obama kind of got over the finish line.
Why do you think? Do you think it's the same reasons that you were mentioning before about being ratings driven? Why do you think that so many political anchors, reporters kept saying that, Romney was going to, even people like Frank Rich were saying that the race was too close to call and that Romney had a great chance of pulling ahead. Do you think it was to kind of gin up suspense over the campaign, or do you think there was a genuine feeling? And why? What prompted that?
There was a chance that Obama could have won, or excuse me, that Obama could have lost, right? It was certainly very close after the Denver debate. Certainly, if you're talking about June and July, we had Obama ahead, but still, because there was so much uncertainty, only a 60% chance of winning. But you can also go back to 2008, where the panelists on the McLaughlin group, the night before the election, when there was no doubt that Obama was going to win. He was ahead in every poll by 7 or 8 points, right, which is where the margin he won by. Even then, people were saying, oh, it's too close to call. So I think people are afraid of being accountable, right, for kind of sticking their necks out. I think there's this kind of notion of journalistic objectivity, which is complicated, but sometimes it means that, well, you just kind of say half dozen of one and 6 of the other, and you kind of decide for yourself, right? Whereas for me, it's rather biased to say that, oh, you have the vast majority of polls, and in the swing states, probably 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 polls had Obama ahead in Ohio and Colorado and so forth by the end of the campaign, right? To say there are 9 of one and 2 of the other, and to call that the same, that's a biased viewpoint, I think. So I think people are trying to avoid taking sides in politics, and that gets them in trouble. The good thing is that in elections in the long run, each party wins about half the time, right? So you kind of naturally wind up being neutral if you're just kind of telling the truth, basically, right? And being honest about who's going to win at a given moment in time. But that doesn't mean that every election is 50-50.
Why do you think your methodology has rankled so many, political reporters? I was reading some quotes, and Joe Scarborough, Peggy Noonan, both pretty disparaging. Politico's Dylan Byers said this may shock the coffee-drinking NPR types of Seattle, San Francisco, and Madison, Wisconsin, but more than a few political pundits and reporters, including some of his own colleagues, believe silver is highly overrated.
Well, look, I'm a competitive guy, and part of what we're saying is that a lot of these people who have jobs going on TV, and not reporters, but pundits, I think are basically useless and exist as entertainers and don't really provide any insight to what's actually going on in the real world. And we we say that less and less politely, I guess, over the course of the campaign. But so yeah, there's a direct challenge to people's kind of careers. There's the other thing too is you get a lot of pushback from partisans. Obviously, look, you have a lot of people in D.C. Who are in the business of trying to alter reality, basically, right? And when you say, no, there is a reality here, and we're going to have a gut check, a reality check on November 6th, and here's a simple forecast of what's going to happen. That's why I say before, I don't think our models are really that complicated, right? Just saying, let's look at the state polls, look at the economy, and that's kind of it. We're not trying to have very different variables, really. We're trying to find a very good way to measure the economy and a good way to find the true signal within the polls. But conceptually, it's pretty simple. It basically boils down to, look, Obama's ahead in every poll in Ohio, so he's probably going to win. Not a lot more complicated than that, really. And the fact that it's hard to spin away that fact for people who are used to kind of always manipulating reality. There's also like an H.L. Mencken, I think, quote that basically says that if you're someone, it's hard, if you would lie in someone else's shoes, and it's hard to believe they're being honest, right? So I think you have a lot of political operatives who are fundamentally dishonest, right? And they can't believe that, even though I have my own political views, certainly, right?
And
they
you
can't believe that anyone
actually
would.
told people that you were an Obama supporter in 2008,
In
right?
2008, I was kind of open as an Obama supporter, yeah. I didn't vote. I haven't voted since then. I mean, I still am kind of basically leftish of center.
Yeah, but I know you have some conservative leanings too.
I do.
You talked about that.
Yeah, I mean, on some, I mean, certainly on economic issues, I'm kind of more of a centrist and kind of more of a libertarian. I don't know. I'll put it like this: when I went to do a book tour in the UK recently, right? And there, kind of what David Cameron, who's not very popular at the moment, right? But kind of what the Tories say over there, I think is kind of a nice sweet spot where it seems kind of quite rational, I suppose. They're for gay marriage, for instance, although they haven't passed it there yet. And so it seems like, I don't know, I think the Republican Party right now is caught in a frame where it's become very anti-empirical. It's become kind of anti-science in some ways. And I think and it is a problem, I think, with Republicans and not conservatives, right? People say, oh, it's kind of the Tea Party, it's kind of dragging the party. I'm not sure that's so true, right? I think it's actually kind of the capital R Republican Party that's become problematic, and not kind of the fact that there are people with more conservative views necessarily.
Just because I mentioned Dylan Byers' nasty quote, I have to read a quote that you said about Peggy Noonan, who I think is a very gifted writer, but the quote is very funny. You said Peggy Noonan is someone who is very, very skilled at making bullshit look like some elegant souffle. She's very good at rhetoric and argument, but it's still not grounded in the truth. It all falls apart every 4 years. So you basically do feel pundits, the problem is that they're good at rhetoric and argument, but they don't have the facts to back it up.
She's an extraordinary writer.
Yeah,
right?
she is. I think so too.
But yeah, I stand behind the quote. I mean, it's part of the issue is that you have people who move from being kind of operatives in a political context to being kind of to working for newspapers, which I find very strange. And certainly as I've kind of gone on in life, I've like I said, in 2008, I was a bit more kind of passionate about the politics myself, right? But the more I've done this, the more I think they really are kind of opposite things. You have to decide: am I someone who's trying to stand back and analyze things, or am I someone who's trying to change the outcome, right? Are you kind of an analyst or an activist? I think an analyst is allowed to have political views, and they probably should have opinions about something if they cover a field for a living. But it's not the same thing as trying to manipulate public opinion. And so the idea
isn't that what editorial pages are all about?
Well, I don't know. I mean, there are lots of great editorial columns, I think. But I think, I don't know. I guess I'll be controversial. I guess I think that in some ways the editorial page is contradictory to other aims sometimes of news organizations, right?
Do you think political reporting is relying, though, so much of what you do is based on this, big data or whatever, and do you feel like the coverage is relying too much on polls and not enough on where a candidate stands, his or her governing styles, issues that will really kind of illuminate someone's decision ultimately on election day?
If you ask people, do you want more issues-driven coverage, they always say yes, and then when you try and provide that coverage, the ratings aren't usually aren't usually very good. So it's a difficult, it's a difficult problem, I think. One thing that makes my life easier is that there is an appetite for coverage of polls and the horse race coverage, right? So I can kind of have my cake and eat it too, where say, oh, we're kind of doing things the right way, right? But we're also getting a lot of traffic on the website. And that's not always true for other types of problems. Maybe we'll have to move to a model where you have a kind of for-profit journalism sector and you have kind of a nonprofit sector as well, because there is social good to covering those issues, certainly.
And some people do that well.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think, look, I think there are a lot of people, I like the stuff that Ezra Klein does at the Washington Post, for example. There is better coverage, I think, now of policy as well than before. It's kind of not my specialty per se, but
Right.
But look, I mean, a lot of this stuff isn't that. I mean, the fundamental movement is that it's moving away from insider narratives toward people who are kind of on the outside looking in and saying, look, here's some data, and I can actually have that skill set myself. I can actually analyze this data myself and kind of do my own thinking and do that thinking out loud within the context of a blog post or an article. And that paradigm, I think, is a little bit different.
You, obviously, a big part of your career has been showing where the conventional wisdom is wrong. So what conventional wisdom today in politics or elsewhere do you think is totally off the mark?
One thing, this is not a monumental thing, but one kind of small thing that comes to mind with the decision on the Voting Rights Act, for example. I think people probably overestimate the impact of gerrymandering. This is one of those things that Democrats get too worried about. There's no doubt that Democrats are harmed by the fact that you have, the district where I used to live in Brooklyn voted 90% for Barack Obama last year. So you have a lot of wasted and redundant Democratic votes in cities that hurts them when they're trying to win marginal seats for the U.S. House, right? People think all these districts are gerrymandered, and a few are, but mostly just the fact that people are now concentrating in urban areas, and urban areas have become really, really very liberal, right? Where the white people are liberal, you also probably have Hispanic, African American, Asian American voters who are all Democratic, very strongly so, especially in the case of African American voters. And so you have these pockets that are, these big kind of blue hotspots, and then the rest of the country is kind of slightly tilting toward red, and that hurts Democrats a bit in races for the House. So it's just based on how people are sorting themselves much more than it is about any deliberate attempt to gerrymander things.
What about the conventional wisdom that Barack Obama is struggling in his second term because of the lack of legislative accomplishments? I mean, what would you analyze to see if there's actual empirical evidence to back that claim up? Because everyone seems to be making it.
It's tricky. I mean, I think people always tend to probably overrate how much responsibility the president has for different type of things, and they're usually, probably 80% of it is kind of you're constrained by your circumstances, and you hope to get the 20% of it right. But but in general, I think the coverage of politics is probably too president-centric, not just Obama-centric. It would be the same for Bush or for Clinton or for anyone else, right? It's easier to have a narrative where you have a protagonist, right? And so it's like, what does the Supreme Court decision rule about, say about Obama? Is it a win for him? Right? I'm sure there's some Politico article like that now about the court decision on DOMA, right? The answer is nothing, of course, right? I guess he appointed...
You just had to get back to Politico.
Yeah, he appointed Sotomayor and Kagan, right? But apart from that, this is probably a little bit baked into the cake no matter what. But you'll still have a narrative about how it's a win for Obama, and it kind of breaks this losing streak, and yeah. But Politico is, it's not a totally arbitrary target where they have taken a lot of shots at me, and they're kind of very proudly of this kind of manner of horse race coverage and driving the conversation. I'm not really sure what that means, really, right? It means that we're leading people away from the truth, so they'll keep following Politico, and I don't know. It seems like you're deliberately kind of playing up that you're taking the noise, what I call the noise, and making too much of it instead of actually trying to find where the truth lies.
Let's talk about future. Actually, before we talk about the future, let's talk about the big surprise of the 2012 race, which was really the power of the changing demographics. Do you think people were caught off guard by that, Nate, surprisingly, or not so much?
I think, well, I don't know. I think the Romney campaign folks were clearly caught a little bit by surprise on election night. I think their feeling was that they personally disliked Obama so much. I thought, there's no way he's going to get reelected, right? And that might be a case of they're kind of talking to too many people who are like themselves and not different groups of people of different races and different social classes who might have different takes on things. So I think that's part of it. I also think there's a danger, though, to Democrats actually in becoming too complacent about this. Look, it's absolutely the case that if in perpetuity, if Democrats always win 75% of the Hispanic vote and 95% of the African American vote, unless they won 75% of the Asian vote as well, right? If those things are always true and they hold their share of the white vote, then they'll keep doing better and better. But it probably won't always be true. One thing about immigrant groups in the United States that they tend to integrate, and that groups that we once thought of as being minorities, whether they were Irish or Italian, are now thought of as being white. And also the parties are allowed to adapt themselves. You see the GOP struggling now with immigration reform, I think, but they're at least making an effort to do that. So yeah, I think people, I'm skeptical of kind of emerging majority arguments. They have a really bad track record. If you look at almost every election, right, where someone wins by more than like a point, is seen as the sign of a future wave building, when in fact there's really a lot of reversion to the mean. And as I said, over the long run, it's very hard for a party to win more than a few elections, a couple of elections in a row. And so it's right to be skeptical about those claims. Doesn't mean that Republicans can do nothing at all and expect it's their turn, but it does mean that if they make some effort to adapt and to correct some of their deficiencies in having a turnout game last year, that the next election, the close approximation is a 50-50 toss-up at this stage.
Well, what about Hillary Clinton? Everyone thinks she's the presumptive, front runner, the favorite front runner, not only for the Democratic nominee, but also ultimately as president. What's wrong and right with that conventional wisdom in your view?
I think she is. So this is a question where you say, well, to the closest approximation, it's 50-50 going into 2016. If Hillary runs, would you take that side of the bet? I think probably. I would say definitely right, but she wouldn't be a slam dunk in the general election where, look, if Obama has a 38% approval rating, which could happen or something by 2016, then that'll be problematic for her. If the economy is in recession again by 2016, that'll be problematic again for her. You look at issues like Benghazi, where Republicans who had an incentive to be very deferential to Hillary for much of her tenure. First, she was kind of the foil to Obama, so they wanted to defeat him. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend all of a sudden, right? And then, secretaries of state typically receive somewhat deferential treatment.
Think that'll change?
But it sure has changed right now, right? So it would get very nasty. But she is a very skilled candidate. I think people forget that, yes, Clinton lost the race in 2008 in the primary, but it's more that Obama won. You might have had the two best Democratic candidates since 1972 when the primary era began, who happened to run in the same year. Democrats are fortunate that they had both of those options, because otherwise you might have had John Edwards, who John Edwards was, believe it or not, he was someone who had been on the VP ticket in 2004, a guy with a fair amount of charisma, among other things, right? But he's a guy who, in a typical year, could easily have won the Democratic nomination. But he had two very, very, very kind of strong candidates running, and so Hillary was a second place, but I think that's not indicative of her political skills. She'd be very tough to defeat in the primary, that's for sure, if she went.
Who do you see as the strong Republican candidates, or the strongest Republican candidates emerging?
Well, I think their most talented politician by a wide margin right now is Chris Christie. I'm not sure that Chris Christie could win the GOP nomination, though.
Why?
Because he's someone who's, I think, authentically a moderate. There are debates about is Christie kind of a conservative and moderate, clothing the other way around, but I think if you look at his track record, it's not on every issue. It's certainly not on he had comments tonight about the Supreme Court decision that were trying to bolster his conservative credentials, but still on enough issues, from gun control to the environment to kind of federal relief for Hurricane Sandy, and also just kind of the postures like a candidate takes, right? Where he's like, I'm kind of putting my state first, and that means embracing the present step with relief. That's what I'm going to do. His temperament is pretty different than where maybe the average voter in Iowa or South Carolina is right now. You saw he was already disinvited from CPAC earlier this year, and so I'm not saying it's impossible, but usually a party tends to nominate someone who's a representative of that party's overall views at the time, and not someone who deviates all that much ideologically. They try and balance that with some concern about electability, so not kind of a Rick Santorum purist type necessarily, but still I think Christie is the kind of candidate who maybe like Giuliani in 2008 would do really well in the polls, and then once it gets down to trying to get votes in Iowa, there'd be more conservative alternatives that would tend to win and then gain momentum throughout the process.
There was a piece in the New York Times Magazine, then I'm going to open it up for questions because I know a lot of people have questions in the audience, but recently in the New York Times Magazine that explored this new venture by former Obama operatives, I'm sure you probably read it or know about it, that are planning to use the same analytics that they did to move voters or to analyze the electorate, to move consumers and to get products off the shelves, or people going into Caesars in Las Vegas. What do you think about that? Do you think that's perfectly, acceptable use of data, or do you feel like it's a slightly creepy and big brothery?
Yeah, I mean, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should, right? And so people kind of say, well, I'm not an advocate for big data at all. Really, I'm kind of someone who says, you can solve some types of problems by looking at data, of course. But yeah, it can be a little bit creepy. There's one story about how I think it was Target, the retail corporation, who now tracks their customers accurately enough where they can tell what women buy supposedly as they're expecting a child, right? And so they'll send them coupons or customize the catalog even that are based around that assumption that they're going to have a child soon. And so there was some father who's 17-year-old got a lot of flyers in the mail for kind of pregnancy and new baby gear, right? And he called Target and he was pretty upset about this implication. And of course, a week later, the daughter comes to him and says, "Dad, I have something to tell you," right? Yeah, we have to decide about. I mean, you certainly see in some of these NSA allegations, right? That I think we have to kind of, if we want to have privacy, we have to stand up and really fight for it, right? It's not my gig again to be an advocate, right? But without active protections, then if data is out there, then it's going to get analyzed well or badly, but it's going to get analyzed, it's going to get duplicated, going to get copied, and so if you don't start to have some societal standards, then yeah, there are going to be kind of violations of people's privacy, and the question is kind of where does that surplus go? I was traveling recently on a flight. I had my phone and my iPad. You can kind of log on to GoGo wireless internet, right? And on the iPad, they want to charge me $18 for a transcon flight, right? Whereas the guy sitting next to me on his crappy laptop, right? He opened his computer up. They wanted $5 from him instead, right? Because they know that it's probably a different type of consumer, different type of price point. And so there, all that surplus goes to the consumer potentially, or the producer rather. But there are also cases where e-commerce makes all the extra surplus go to the customer basically. Where I recently bought a piece of luggage at Bloomingdale's, right? And the sales clerk was very good. He's like, "Oh, you don't want that piece of luggage, right? This one's it's a Swiss brand, and they have a 5-year guarantee. It's like a piece of luggage, right? Who really cares, right? I'll give you $50 off, right? So you buy it, think you got a really good deal on this $250 suitcase, right? And you go on Amazon.com and it's $112 or something instead, right? So that kind of thing is a case where the consumer benefits, and so that can cut both ways a little bit.
So let's open it up to some questions from the audience, because I know we've got some political junkies here. Do you want to ask that gentleman?
Hi, Nate. Your model for 538.com is self-training and fine-tuning based on results. So I'm curious, after the November 2012 elections, what are a couple of the ways in which you see the fine-tuning really taking effect for the next go-round?
Yeah, and I'm not a fan of the problem is you still only have kind of one event. You have kind of one election every 4 years. So the idea is not to change things too much. It's worked well enough. But one thing is how the model reacts to different types of of news events. So for example, it was slow to recognize Obama's bounce after the convention. It was slow to recognize Romney's rebound after the first debate. Part of that is that most of the time when you see a bunch of polls that come out that show a shift, it's just circumstance a lot of the time, just kind of random noise. But if you have some event that precipitates it, it might be different. So you might have the logic trade differently where it's more aggressive after what I call set pieces in the campaign, so debates and conventions, and adjust more quickly after that. But still, in both those cases, right, you could have kind of chased Obama's bounce after the conventions where he was up by 6 or 7 points in some polls, but that would have overestimated how well he would have done, and likewise, you could have chased Romney's gain after the debate and said, it really is a toss-up, but that would have overestimated how well Romney would do, and so kind of taking a long-run approach is also more helpful. I think there's a lot more work to do, by the way, on trying to forecast the primaries, where we had kind of a very simple model in 2012 that just looked at the polls and took them at face value, and the polls and primaries are not very good. So looking at other factors. In primaries, for example, looking at how many endorsements a candidate has is a very good leading indicator. Parties have a lot of control on how they kind of merchandise the candidates. You remember during early last year when Newt Gingrich was piled on, like basically nuked by the GOP, right? They're like, oh, he was harmless until, oh my gosh, he actually might win, so let's basically nuke him off the face of the earth by running lots of attack ads, and it worked, right? Parties have those abilities in the primaries to kind of control the narrative that's harder in a general election environment sometimes. So looking at what kind of party insiders think as measured by endorsements and fundraising and so forth will sometimes give you a better view than the polls alone.
How do you quantify the effectiveness of attack ads? Some are more effective than others, so how do you measure that?
I mean, there have been studies of kind of how much ads matter, and it's usually a fairly marginal effect. So one thing that's interesting is that ads have a very, very short lifespan, right? So you might go out and if you see an ad for Pizza Hut, kind of maybe you'll go to Pizza Hut that night, right? But probably won't affect what you do a week from then. Likewise, if you see an ad for Obama, you might go out and vote for Obama that day. But first of all, it won't last for long. Second of all, Romney's probably running the same number of ads, right? So it kind of, if the campaigns could have kind of a truce in the arms race, say let's not waste so much money on ads, then it might be kind of mutually beneficial. But where advertising and money matters are in down ballot races, like races for the House, for example. If you have $1 million to spend and your opponent has $1,000, then that's a big difference, right? Even though $1 million might not buy you all that many ads, that means you get on TV, build name recognition, and they probably don't. Conversely, if you have $500 million as a presidential candidate, the other candidate has $700 million, probably doesn't matter very much. You're well past the point of diminishing returns where you see the 800th ad for Obama in Colorado probably won't change your mind all that much.
That gentleman right there. Hi.
Hi, Nathan. It's about 18 months before the actual election, and I'm talking about the U.S. Senate races, so I'm not going to hold you to it. But and there are a lot of Democrats who are going to be running for re-election. Their 6-year terms are over in 2014. But what do you think the chances are of the Republicans retaking the Senate, or put another way, the Democrats losing the Senate?
The GOP, I would say, has a pretty decent shot of taking the Senate back. I'd say maybe in the range of 35 or 40%, so not quite 50-50, but not that far from it. Democrats, this year is an echo of 2008, where you're in 6-year terms for the Senate. So 2008, all the Democrats who benefited from Obama's coattails won't have them now. It tends to be a tough year for the midterm election for the party whose president is in power. And just you've had a lot of Democratic retirements as well. The counter to that is that you do have to have 6 GOP seats that are picked up by the time that I'm assuming that Cory Booker will win in New Jersey later this year. But you need 6 gains, and so you can't make a lot of errors. You might have 8 or 9 decent chances, but if you begin to nominate, for example, in Alaska, they may nominate Joe Miller, who's this guy who they nominated against Lisa Murkowski. Murkowski came back and won as an independent. But he's someone who would probably, I think, hand a seat to Democrats when it would be a competitive race otherwise. They have problematic candidates in Iowa and in Georgia. So it's kind of the same story as it's been for some of the past couple of years, where they would have I'd say it might be 50-50, or even in their favor if they really nominate strong candidates across the board. But if they begin to give away 1 or 2 seats, then it becomes a lot trickier.
So other than Chris Christie, who do you see emerging? Because I didn't really ask you, in addition to Chris Christie, and you don't think that he's likely to be the nominee. So who else? Marco Rubio?
I think Rubio is kind of the closest thing to a front runner right now, where he gets a lot of media coverage. He's kind of building up a very large campaign team. I think he's not incredible. I think he's not a kind of in the Clinton-Reagan category for political talent, but he's a pretty good politician. So he'd be a perfectly, I think, average, adequate, fine nominee who would win if it was a good year for the GOP. I think a guy who's overlooked a bit is Scott Walker, maybe. Again, he doesn't share all my views, but he's someone who has seen success both electorally and in terms of his agenda in a bluish, kind of purplish state, which is kind of a credential, but unlike Christie, someone who certainly really is a conservative. Go down to Iowa, a nearby state, that could help him potentially. So he's someone who doesn't get talked about in this horse race coverage enough, where you kind of look on paper and say, here's a guy who's overperformed in his state, right? Conservatives like him. He's near Iowa. It seems like a lot of things that are adding up to him being an overlooked candidate.
What about Democrats? What about Joe Biden? Do you think he's likely to throw his hat in the ring, and how would he fare going toe-to-toe with Hillary Clinton?
I don't think he would, well, I know what his intentions are. I think he would not want to run in the same primary as Hillary would. I think no Democrat who was looking toward, unless they're looking toward the future, building up their name brand, would really want to do that.
So do you see any Democrats who are at least starting to put their toe in the water?
I think everyone is waiting for Hillary. I mean, it's almost as though she's, from the standpoint of the party primary, it's almost as though she's an incumbent president, right? Where she even trumps kind of the VP very often wins the nomination after a president is term limited. But you look at polls and like 60 or 70% of Democrats say they prefer Hillary to be the nominee. There's no kind of non-incumbent in history with those types of numbers. So it'd be very difficult, and the problem is she has to decide at some point, or it's going to disadvantage other Democrats who would want to run, especially because a lot of their candidates, from Kristen Gillibrand to Cuomo, are people who are also in New York or in the Northeast this year, so they kind of be going for the same donor base potentially. But I don't know. I mean, the sense I get from Clinton is that she, this is not personally, just kind of reading the tea leaves, is that she doesn't really like the campaign all that much, but maybe she'd really like to be president and so forth. So she might have an incentive to wait. She doesn't have to build up her name brand at all, so she might not have to declare right away, but she probably has to at least kind of privately signal to Democrats, what am I thinking about? Or you'll have people who will be disadvantaged in the party or who will not wait their turn, right? You'll say, I can't wait until you decide in mid-2015, I've got to start building up my campaign operation, and that might force the issue. But yeah, this is very odd.
When does she have to privately signal?
So I'd say if she is not privately signaled to, say, a Cuomo, or who knows, or an O'Malley, or a Cory Booker, or a Biden by kind of New Year's Day 2015, right, then it becomes problematic, I think. If she were to run, she could say, you know what, guys, don't tell anyone, but I'm probably going to run, and then she could wait until even fairly late in 2015 to declare officially. But privately, I think a campaign's usually a 2-year thing at least to get an operation up and running. I mean,
how long is that going to be private? Come on.
Well, it might not. I don't know. I mean, it's not. There are all kinds of signals usually, and there's kind of even a question about how you define when someone is running for office, right? If someone is talking to donors and lining up a team, right, and they've not officially declared, then in some sense they're kind of running for president, whether they say so or not, right? You could say that Hillary, she's kind of disavowing these different PACs and so forth, but she's doing the types of things that you would think a candidate would do if they were running for president, right? So it's kind of like, she's kind of running now, and will she stop running? The semantics of when she officially says, I'm in, are maybe not the most important thing, where because of her potential presence in the race, right, and her not actively disavowing the race, then she's already blocking out all the other candidates anyway. She doesn't have to say, I'm in, if it's already working. But it does take a long time to get geared up for a campaign. I mean, look at a guy like Rick Perry, who had different types of issues, but he's a guy who had been elected in Texas several times by wide margins. Then he goes and kind of decides somewhat further, I'm going to run a presidential campaign, and it's a total disaster, basically. It's very, very hard to gear up for a national campaign. You look at, go back and watch tapes of Obama from February or March 2007, I guess, when he had just declared. I mean, he was pretty terrible on the stump and at debates, right? Had a good team around him, but I'm sure Hillary, a little bit more practiced, but was not terribly smooth. So you really need kind of a 2-year planning cycle to do this now.
One more, if there's somebody, what's the lady in the black tank top.
Thank you. There was a lot of after-the-fact coverage after the 2012 results that big money through PACs had not made as big a difference as people feared they would. That was obviously the first data point. I'm wondering what kind of impact you think, special interest spending is going to have on, and it seems like it could be a more subtle impact than we think in terms of how they use big data. So, just curious about that.
Well, look, I mean, I certainly think it has influence on how the Congress behaves, and there's a lot of empirical research that lobbying money can make quite a bit of difference. There's a lot of kind of empirical research that kind of policy on economic issues is kind of geared toward what very wealthy people tend to want. And the money makes a difference there, I think. In terms of elections, it's kind of gets back to what I said before, where you encounter diminishing returns. So it's much more useful to have a candidate who can get on the map, so to speak, in a Senate race or a House race when they wouldn't otherwise, and not as useful going to the presidential race instead. Republicans would have spent more money if they gave their Senate candidates more money and less to Romney, I suppose, and likewise Democrats. One reason why the GOP did so well in 2010, they won 63 seats, which a pretty amazing number, especially considering that right now so many districts are not very competitive. They are so Democratic or Republican that there aren't that many swing districts in place. They made a huge gain kind of almost anywhere they could. And part of that is that they had well-financed candidates in every corner of the country where they had a chance. They were making sure they competed, and that's where I think the PAC money began to help a lot. I think it didn't really help Romney all that much. I mean, ironically, it might have hurt him even. Where look, if you're expecting to get most of your money for people with a median income of $50 million or something, right? Then it's going to begin to affect kind of how you talk about the campaign and how you view the world in ways that maybe makes you a little bit out of touch with how even kind of upper middle class Americans might think potentially. So I think it's tricky. I mean, there's no doubt that a lot of the money in politics comes from a relatively small group of people, but it can make the campaigns and the candidates jaded where they go too far in trying to cater to those groups and not enough to kind of the median voter.
So in terms of your future, Nate, I read that you're getting tired of politics, and there was a very funny profile of you, and the writer said, Silver has no intention of becoming the Guy Fieri of Nerdville. I don't know if that was a compliment or not.
Yeah,
It said, or for that matter, to be seduced by the career arc of Malcolm Gladwell. So what would you like to do? I mean, are you going to have a significant presence in 2014 and 2016? Are you going to, I know I read you a front page article on the sports section recently in the New York Times that you wrote. So what is it, what's next for Nate?
Well, first, I hope that I win the World Series of Poker. I think I have almost a 1 in 6,000 chance. But after that, no. So the idea is to expand out the scope of what 538 is covering. Sports is one arena. It's very data driven. I think looking at economic data in a better way. We've talked about everything from kind of urban life to education. But yeah, so I'm a guy who's already done a lot of different things in life, and it really is kind of more of instead of a vertical, I call it like a horizontal approach, right? Like let's take data and other types of objectifiable evidence in different fields, right? Let's begin to make forecasts where we can. Let's make pretty pictures and graphs. Let's have good, crisp writing. Let's be analytical and incisive and critical. That skill set, that paradigm can work not in everything, but across a large number of domains. And also part of it is like, for me to write about the NBA Finals, might be more appropriate than for me to write about the NSA case, right? The NSA case, you do reporting on that, that is a case where you have to have good sources inside different agencies to really shed light on that story, right? So I'm not going to try and cover a political story when it doesn't play into my strengths, when I have colleagues both at the New York Times and the news media more broadly that can do that really, really well. But I can write a fun piece about LeBron versus Michael Jordan, and that, I think, plays off my strengths more. So it's a matter of trying to find myself and probably doing some hiring at 538 to have a few of us who would cover different fields and with the same kind of mentality.
Yeah, I guess when he was reviewing your book in the New York Times, Noam Schreiber wrote, Nate Silver has lived a preposterously interesting life. How old are you?
I'm 35.
Wow. Do you sometimes are you kind of so shocked at what a preposterously interesting life you've led so far?
It's pretty surreal, you're kind of out here being interviewed by Katie Couric and
Oh,
stuff.
yeah,
And it's cool, definitely. But you also have to have, so I will say though, you also have to not be kind of star-shocked too much, and playing poker really helps with that, right? When you play poker, you'll have a lot of wins and losses, right? You'll have very good moments where you feel like you're the best player in the world, and then moments where you feel like you're a terrible fish and a hack who could never win a hand no matter what, right? And you have those highs and lows, and having kind of switched careers a few times, you have personal and professional highs and lows, and that I think helps to keep one grounded a little bit. Part of the reason why, frankly, I want to diversify what I'm doing, what 538 does, is not just that I'm intellectually interested in these topics, but also that, it's not smart to have all your eggs in one basket when I know that sooner or later we're going to get an election way wrong, right? We're supposed to, mathematically, really, right?
Yeah.
And also it's kind of amazing that...
Do you want to quit while you're ahead?
I'm not going to quit. We're going to cover 2014, 2016, right? But to be a little bit careful, I think, potentially. And also to say, but also say, look, right now only about 10% of people actually respond now to polls. And the fact that you can somehow take the 10% and they manage to be reasonably representative of the 100% is kind of astounding. But the response rates to polls go down every year, and sooner or later we're going to have an election where things are just way wrong.
But you said the internet was compensating for that to some degree, right?
It will. I mean, I think you certainly had a good year for internet polls this year in the U.S. election, but you've had a couple of cases in Canada recently, provincial elections in Alberta, British Columbia. Not very high profile, obviously, cases, right? Where the polls were internet polls, and they had been way off, right? And there are moments throughout history, from the New Hampshire primary in 2008 to 1980, where Jimmy Carter was only down by 1 or 2 points on election night in the polls. So if we had a model, then we'd say it's leaning toward Reagan, but could go either way, and Reagan clobbered Carter instead. So you have cases where the polls missed by a pretty big margin. Those happen every now and then. If I do this for 10 more elections, I'm going to have 1 or 2 of those, and that would be bad from a kind of career point of view. Even though mathematically it's kind of, if you make the best prediction you can, then it's going to happen sooner or later. But
well, we're glad you're going to at least keep going in 2014 and 2016. It's going to be, I guess, do you think the 2016 campaign is going to be pretty exciting?
It'll be pretty epic. I mean, especially if you look at the GOP primary, where we used to think about Democrats as having all these kind of sub-constituencies, but the GOP has a lot of thinking to do between the different wings of the party. So you have the kind of libertarians, you have the Tea Party, you have the moderates, you have the kind of the traditional compassionate conservatives, you have the foreign policy hawks, right? And they kind of all got along before, and now they all have different candidates they prefer. So you're going to, I think, have a very interesting 4 or 5-way race. It'll take a lot of time for them to winnow down their field. So that could be an epic battle, I think. And then if you have, anyone against Hillary Clinton, I think that would be very interesting from a rating standpoint, but very compelling, probably election. We can always dream, by the way, of having a true 3-way race, right? Where Christie gets frustrated, goes and becomes an independent. This is the fantasy that every kind of person in politics, myself included, always has, right? Is to have a true 3-way election where you have an independent candidate.
Like a Bloomberg or,
Well, no, I think it would have to be. So, I mean, it's not just, Bloomberg is a guy who, I live in New York, and I'm more or less a fan of his mayorship, but he's kind of a short, rich guy from New York, right? Probably not going to translate.
From Boston, really.
From Boston, yeah. So he's more salt of the earth than people maybe know, but it's not going to translate very well to the median voter in Ohio State. Whereas Christie has
a kind of everyday Joe.
Christie has a lot of political skills, right? And so he is, I think, Clintonian in the sense where where he's somewhat moderate, certainly, right? But he also is someone who makes you feel as though you're on his side. He makes a lot of sense when he begins to talk about an issue, and he's not talking about it to divide people as much. So, you know, he is really talented, and I know a lot of times like candidates in New York, New Jersey, kind of Maryland, Virginia get overrated by the Beltway press, but he's someone who I think really does have very, very strong political skills, and he has very high favorability ratings nationwide in an era where almost no one else but Hillary does. So if you had a kind of, you know, the fantasy from a ratings point of view would be kind of Hillary, Christie, and then, you know, Rubio or something, right? A three-way race. That would be pretty epic, I think.
That would make you happy.
Yeah.
Well, Nate Silver, thank you so much. It was fun talking to you.
Definitely, thank you.
Thank you.